strongly to do is to provide stability for the future. And through a series of interventions over the last few months, I've tried to indicate that's exactly what we will do. And whether it's the environmental land management schemes, whether it's any other issues, we will do that. Now, the government faced a huge challenge at this budget. We all know that. Decisions had to be made. But I'm absolutely convinced that farmers and all those other people who live in rural areas want exactly the same decent health services, housing, transport that they need, and they will be able to carry on farming as they have done. But the difference is in a stable economic system, which means they will not be suffering in the way they have over the last decade.
Joe White.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of the farms in my constituency were underwater for months following the floods last year. My question to the Minister, Mr. Speaker, is what is he doing to support those farms as they recover from those horrific storms last year?
Minister.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for her question. Extreme weather events have quite clearly become a growing challenge to all of us, and that is partly why we're so determined to make that transition to a more environmentally formed farming. Last year, a scheme was in place to help farmers. The then government increased it. As I say, I'm not sure they exactly identified where the money was coming from, but we have identified the money, we've honoured it, and we'll be paying that £60 million out to farmers in the next couple of weeks.
The jurist.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Now, earlier the Minister implied that farmers in my constituency of Bridlington and the Wolds support this measure. I can categorically tell him they do not. They are shattered, Mr. Speaker, by this announcement, and the impact on my community will be devastating. Now, can I ask the Minister today to do the right thing and withdraw these plans?
Minister.
I look forward to many more such exchanges over the dispatch box with the honourable gentleman. What I said earlier was that on my very many visits around the country, I'd consistently found people telling me that they were concerned about the way in which the system was being abused, in which people were coming in and buying up land over their heads. And that is what I said, and that's what I stand by. But in terms of these measures, I'm afraid this is a budget that stands in its entirety, and the whole country needs stability, so it will stand.
Julie Minns.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A few months ago, I visited my constituents Andrew and Ada, who farm in a remote northeast corner of Cumbria and who, sadly, after 14 years under the Conservative government, are largely getting by on Ada's pension. Can I ask the Minister to set out what support will be available to farmers like my constituents following last week's budget?
Can I thank my honourable friend for her contribution? And she's absolutely right. There are many people in this country who are struggling to get by, and many farmers in particular who are struggling to get by. And that is why it's very important that in this budget we maintain the agricultural budget, the support schemes that people are getting used to, and it's interesting to note that they are now being subscribed to in much, much higher numbers, and that there will be that support available to help people make that transition and make sure they can go on supplying food for this country, which is so important.
Sarah Dyke.
Mr. Speaker, it's now more than 10 years since devastating floods wrecked the Somerset Levels and moors, causing untold damage. At the time, affected communities were told that money was no object for protecting the area, but now deep in the budget document is the hint that the farming and flood defence budget might be cut. So can the Minister explain to my farmers in Glastonbury and Somerton, who are terrified more flooding devastation of this winter, how the government aims to protect them?
Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable lady, and I remember those awful times very, very well. Money is no object was not something said from this side of the House, I can tell her. It was said from the other side of the House, and perhaps it wasn't exactly the right way to put it. As I've said, extreme weather events are a challenge for all of us right across the country. I and my colleagues will be working with everyone to find the best ways of resolving that. But let us not for one moment imagine this is a simple issue to solve. Those flooding challenges are very, very real. We're working on them, and I look forward to having further discussions with her.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Minister knows lots of farmers in my constituency. He's a near neighbour of mine, and farmers are very grateful for the engagement that he's had with them. And he knows, Mr. Speaker, that farmers' income has been falling year on year under the previous Conservative government. So can he outline what measures in this budget there are to support the farmers in North West Cambridgeshire and help get the industry back on track?
Minister.
Well, I thank another of my near neighbours. I didn't used to have many near neighbours who are anywhere near as friendly as my new near neighbours, but Cambridgeshire has changed. And Cambridgeshire has changed for a very clear reason, that actually Cambridgeshire lost trust in the party opposite. And one of the reasons why I'm determined that we build trust across the entire country is by maintaining over a prolonged period of time the levels of support that are needed to allow people to farm successfully. So my answer to his question is, just look at the budget where we saw an increase in the farming budget, and we will look to maintain proper support into the future, because exactly as has been said, these are long-term businesses, long-term interests, and the reason they're long-term is because we're all going to need to eat.
Kevin Holding-Ray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister talks about a transition. Well, I was talking to my farmers in Beedale on Friday. The only transition they can see is transition from family farms to the state.
Yes.
Does he realise that the farming industry is one of the least profitable sectors in the country? Return on capital employed 0.5%, and that's the government's own figures. That's around a 20th of the typical profit margin in the UK. How can he justify, other than some warped socialist ideology, how can he justify taking away 40 years of profits to the typical farm?
Minister.
Well, the honourable gentleman may wish to remember the agricultural transition was embarked upon by the then government, a 7-year transition process. We're just over halfway through it, and it's important that it's maintained in a stable, sensible way, and that is exactly what we're doing. So my answer to his question is, the challenge that was put to me was maintain stability, don't tear up those schemes, maintain them, make them work, and that is exactly what we are doing.
Sam Rushworth.
Mr. Speaker, I met with farmers in my constituency in the days just ahead of the budget. The biggest concern that they raised with me was not actually inheritance tax, but it was the transition from basic payments to ELMS. And I very much welcome that the budget not only maintained the agricultural budget, but grew the agricultural budget, something that they said we wouldn't do. But there is a concern that under the previous government, despite having the budget there, the system was written in such a way that the smallest farms were not actually able to easily access that funding. And that is the single biggest threat to agricultural businesses in my area. And I rather think this is a smokescreen. So would the Minister comment on this, and what will this government do to ensure that we can draw down that budget and make sure that local farms take advantage?
Well, again, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for his contribution. Of course, it was quite striking that under the previous government, the agricultural budget was so substantially underspent. Now, we're fixing that. We're fixing that, making it possible for people to access those schemes in the way that he describes. But it's interesting, he says that the issue that came up most was those basic payments. I'll tell the House the issue that came up time after time on my visits, it was actually rural crime. And that is the thing which has troubled so many people on farms and in the countryside, and that's why it's so important that this government is setting up a proper integrated rural crime strategy.
Simon Hoare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister is seeing silver linings in clouds hanging over family farms and tenanted farms in North Dorset, which I must confess I have failed to see. So I'm going to give the Minister a very simple yes or no question. Yes or no? Will he come to North Dorset to meet farmers in my constituency, to explain to them these wonderful silver linings in the clouds that he can see and none of us on this side can?
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman, and I love visiting farms all over the country, and I'm sure North Dorset will feature on my list at some point in the future. But can I just say, around this whole question of optimism, pessimism, and this stress and strain in the countryside, my honourable friend earlier warned about some of the things that are being said, and I would just urge people to be temperate in their language on these issues, because people are very, very stressed and anxious and worried. My task is to be calm, sensible, reassuring to them, reminding them the vast majority of people will be able to pass on their farms just as they have before. But just as pressing, tackle those other very real issues they face. Now, I do not underestimate the challenge that people face. Of course it's difficult. We know it's hard, but this government is going to do everything we can to support people and maintain their prosperity into the future.
Louise Jones.
Mr. Speaker, many of the farmers in my constituency of North East Derbyshire have regularly raised concerns with me over protecting farms and our food system from animal diseases. Can the Secretary of State please outline what steps he is taking to protect both our food and our farming systems?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for raising a really, really important point, because amongst them, the many, many things that are stressful for farmers, of course, has been not just the weather of the last few years, but the disease threats as well. So whether it was avian flu, whether it's blue tongue, we're absolutely committed to helping, and as part of that in this budget, we've committed over £200 million to start the process of upgrading the facilities at Weybridge, which is so very, very important for biosecurity in future. And we should, I should also say that biosecurity is so important. I was staggered, frankly, that the previous government did not take swifter action to protect our borders around African swine fever. We've toughened the rules on that, and I can see the honourable gentleman nodding, and he's well versed in this, he knows.
Can I just say, brevity will be helpful, because I do believe everybody has a constituency interest. So I really want to get them in. So we can have shorter answers, that will be better. Also, if you looked at me now and again, would also help me to hear what's being said. Right, let's try a good example of speed. Simon Hoare. That's the quickest question we've had yet. Geoffrey Clifton Brown, Sir Jeff.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I declare my interest as a farmer, register interest as a farmer? How would the Minister answer my 75-year-old farmer who emailed me last week? And he said, we work long hours, usually alone. The agriculture has one of the highest suicide rates in any industry. There is a great deal of talk these days about mental health and the need to alleviate stress in the workplace. Yet the Chancellor and the Secretary of State for Agriculture last week destroyed everything I've ever worked for. How would he answer that?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I would reassure him that I'm afraid I don't think he's correct on that, and that we're absolutely determined to make sure that he can hand on his farm. He can hand on his farm as others have done before, but let's make sure he gets the proper advice.
Ashley Dalton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've spent about 14 months in this place asking the former government about water management, but I was always on a hiding to nothing. So I wonder whether my honourable friend can tell me if he recognises that the farmers in my constituency of West Lancashire have got a lot of expertise around water management and land management. And can he tell us how this budget supports farmers to bring that expertise to the fore and work in partnership with us to manage that land and water?
Best potatoes.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and what I would say is that the schemes we have in place will help us work with farmers on those issues, alongside, of course, the payment of that £60 million that the previous government promised.
Seamus Logan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister asks for members to be temperate in their language, but there is deep, deep anger in Scotland and in my constituency in Aberdeenshire, North Murray East, about these announcements. Now, they stated by the Policy Director for the NFU in Scotland, these announcements will be devastating for farmers and crofters. Can the Minister tell us how these announcements are going to increase food security and national security, please?
Minister.
Well, once again, Mr. Speaker, what I would say is that by having a stable, sensible approach to farming support in the coming years, and clearly in Scotland this has evolved a different matter. It's for the Scottish Government to determine how they operate, but we are setting the overall context, and in a stable economy in the future, farmers will thrive.
Luke Myers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud to represent proud North Yorkshire farmers in my constituency. I wonder if the Secretary of State can set out the steps he will be taking to ensure that small family farms will be protected by this government. And additionally, I wonder if he will endorse polyhalite, a fantastic crop nutrient fertiliser produced in only one place in the world, North Yorkshire.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I will always look with keen interest at anything that can help us make progress. But in terms of of how we provide support and reassurance to those small farmers, it is again, I say, by making sure we've got a strong, stable economy.
John May.
I refer to the Register of Interests. Is the Minister surprised by the reaction of the farming community?
Minister.
Well, I thank my fellow East Anglian MP for his contribution. Am I surprised? No, I'm not entirely surprised, because people are very, very fed up and depressed, and they've been depressed for a long time. So I understand why it's difficult. But I have to say that my job is to reassure, to talk calmly to people, and that's what I should continue to do.
Luke Charters.
I'm proud to represent many wonderful farming communities in York Outer, and the young farmers that I meet tell me that one of their biggest challenges is accessing rural mental health. Does my honourable friend welcome the record £22 billion extra going into the NHS, which will support access to rural mental health?
Minister.
My honourable friend is absolutely right. It's the core message of this budget that we get our finances stable and on track, and that will allow us to invest in the public services that everyone needs, particularly those in rural areas who are struggling with these issues.
Helen Morgan.
Mr Speaker, one of the many emails I've received over the last week is from a farmer who has an archetypal family farm, 330 acres of mixed dairy and arable, that they're planning on to pass on to their son, even though they're struggling to make ends meet at the moment. He's typical of farmers in my constituency. He's very concerned, and I'm afraid we haven't seen any investment in public transport or any of those other sweeteners that the Minister mentioned in his earlier opening remarks. Can he explain what investment is going to go into rural public transport and why he has set the threshold for APR so low?
Minister.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her contribution. I think it's a wait a bit longer to see the transport improvement. It's only a week. But the point about the level is that has been set by the Treasury based on the figures that we have, and trying to make sure that it's fair. And as I say, the vast majority will not be paying anything, which I hope she will find reassuring.
John Morris.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Now, for 14 years, farmers in my constituency were let down and betrayed by the Conservative government on things like the Australia-New Zealand trade deal, repeated broken promises, and that saw thousands of farm businesses close across the country. Does the Minister share my assessment that they were betrayed for those 14 years?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend. I don't think it's my assessment. I think it was the assessment of the voters. Made it very clear.
Lee Anderson.
Mr Speaker, now then, Sam Wilson is a farmer in Ashfield. He's not a rich man. In fact, he's not drawn a wage in the past 4 years. So I want the Minister, Mr Speaker, to look me in the eyes and tell me how many farmers he's spoken to over the past few months that actually agree with this harebrained scheme.
Minister.
Well, the last farmer I spoke to over the weekend congratulated me on what we were doing.
Dave Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. There appears to be a lot of discussion about agricultural property relief on inheritance tax today. Can I ask the Minister to confirm what percentage of those farms which claimed more than £1 million of agricultural property relief across the last 2 years, what percentage of them had actually received any agricultural income in the last 5 years?
Minister.
Well, I thank my honourable friend. I'll have to go away and get the answer to that, but I'll write to him.
No. Stuart Anderson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. South Shropshire farmers have been in touch with me over the weekend, and they're up in arms about changes to APR which they were told, Mr Speaker, by the party opposite wouldn't happen. Absolutely. Will the Minister reverse this rural vandalism and back British farmers?
We will back British farmers by making sure they have a stable system in which they can flourish.
It's extraordinary that a small number of wealthy landowners have been using agricultural property relief to avoid inheritance tax. What is more extraordinary is how the party opposite have defended tax avoidance in the way that they have. Will my honourable friend confirm to the farmers in my constituency and across the country that the budget will benefit family farmers, and it will do so through the investment in public services as well as through the proposals in agriculture?
Minister.
My honourable friend makes a powerful point. Not only do those people seem to relish finding ways of creatively running their accounts, some of them even, of course, take money to write columns about them as well.
Dr. Caroline Johnson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
I should declare that my husband is in agriculture and farming and therefore I have an indirect financial interest in the topic. This government promised it would not raise national insurance contributions, and then it has. It promised it would not reduce agricultural property relief, and then it has. It's also added a fertiliser tax and tax on pickup trucks as a way of compounding the misery. Has the Minister done an impact assessment on food security and food prices caused by this budget, and will he publish it?
Yes.
Well, the Honourable Lady will know that there are many things that impact food prices, and I would just gently suggest to the party opposite they don't want to look too closely at food price rises over the last few years before giving us any lectures on how we might manage things. The reason I'm confident about this is because when I look at the figures issued by the Treasury on the number of claims that were made in the last few years, our figures stack up.
Yes.
Yeah. Claire Young.
I previously raised in departmental questions that farmers I speak to are reluctant to sign up for ELMS due to their complexity and not wanting to get locked into a deal when there might be a better one around the corner, which may account for the £200 million underspend last year. In the budget, the government committed to maintaining that funding at the current level, including this underspend, but said it will be reviewed in 25-26 to, quote, ensure they are affordable. Does the Secretary of State agree that this leaves farmers even more in the dark about their future at a time when they're struggling to get by?
She raises an important point, but I suspect this will come out in the months ahead, that actually over the last few months there's been a big uptick in the number of people making claims for SFI, which says to me that we're actually now on track to make these systems work for people. But I don't disagree with her that under the last government it was a very long, painful process. But now we're making progress, we need to make it work.
Dame Priti Patel.
Quite frankly, whether or not the Minister recognises that these changes not only break the promises that they have made previously to farmers on APR, but they are going to add significant burdens and costs to family farms and disincentivise food production.
Minister.
Well, I also wish my fellow East Anglian MP, Right Honourable Member, good luck in the coming hours. But on her point, the reason that we can look forward to a successful and stable future for farmers across the east of England and the rest of the country is we have absolutely committed to stability. The reason things have had to be different is because what we found, and I found this in my department just as fellow ministers found in their departments, the situation was far worse than we'd been led to believe. We had to tackle that problem.
Ann Davies.
As a tenant dairy farmer myself and chair of FUW Carmarthenshire, perhaps I realise and understand this more than anybody else in this chamber. The government is trying to portray farming as an industry of super wealthy landowners, and that's simply not the case in Wales, let me tell you. Welsh upland farmers in mountainous and hilly areas have an average annual income of £18,600. Yes, you heard correctly, £18,600, which is far below the national living wage for hours which are way beyond your average 40-hour week. What assessment has the Minister made for the impact of the changes to the APR in Wales, where wages for farmers are so low?
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, and she's absolutely right. Farming is very tough right across the country, and it's very difficult in Wales. It is a devolved issue, so I won't comment on the specific schemes in Wales, but I would point her back to the Treasury figures which show the number of people who made claims for agricultural property relief, and it is relatively few, and I would say it's probably relatively few in Wales.
John Glenn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I spent most of the last 6 years looking at Treasury figures, and I have a great deal of sympathy for the honourable gentleman. I fear he is a victim of a hit-and-run exercise by the Treasury on the DEFRA budget. I think he would do well to think about the lessons learned from the pasty tax, because he's not careful. This is going to be of a similar dimension for this government.
Minister.
I'm very grateful for the right honourable gentleman's concern, but I have to say I don't agree with him.
David Chadwick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister confirm how many farms in Wales will be impacted by the changes to APR in the budget?
Minister.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his question. I don't think it's broken down by national area at the moment, but it's something we can go away and have a look at.
Kit Malthouse.
Mr. Speaker, I draw attention to my entry in the register. Farmers and indeed family businesses are deeply alarmed because an important principle on which they've relied for decades has been breached, and it's obvious from the Red Book that the Chancellor will have to raise tax again in the future. So is this the end, or can farmers and small businesses expect yet more demands on death?
Minister.
I'm grateful for the right honourable gentleman. He says decades. Of course, it's 1992 when the 1991-2 when the current rules were introduced. But I can absolutely assure him that we're now on track for a stable future ahead, and that will allow farmers in his constituency and across the east of England to flourish.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Family farms are very often cash poor. Each time the average farm is passed from a parent to a child, the family may have to generate an extra £500,000. They may deal with this by trying to make each acre produce an additional £40 of profit. This could send into reverse the agricultural transition to a more nature-friendly farming approach and might revert to more agrochemicals and intensive methods. As I asked the Minister at last week's adjournment debate, what did he do ahead of the budget to combat this appalling measure?
Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for the question. The honourable member asks what we did. What we did was we looked at the farming budget and made sure that we protected it to allow his constituents and constituents across the country to take part in his schemes that will support them in that important transition.
Sir Julian Lewis.
How does the Minister reconcile his sensible acceptance of the fact that food security is vital for national security with farmland being split up and sold off, probably for development as a result of the budget changes?
Minister.
The honourable gentleman raises an important point which we'll be addressing through the National Land Use Framework, which will come forward in the next couple of months. Of course there are trade-offs. There are a whole range of pressures on our land for housing, for food, for energy, so many things. We need to have a rational way of making those decisions, and that's exactly what we will introduce.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the Minister, the Secretary of State and the Chancellor aware that so serious are the consequences of this policy that the heads of farming families in their 80s and 90s are seriously considering committing suicide before this policy comes into place?
I don't need any after comments, Minister.
I find it hard to respond to a question like that. I spoke earlier about using language carefully, and I would just reiterate that point.
Sir Roger Gale.
In the rural England that I'm privileged to represent part of, they say that you should live as if you're going to die tomorrow and farm as if you're going to live forever. Does the government not understand that if we inheritance tax our farms out of existence, there will be no forever, and there will be no food from what was once the Garden of England?
Minister.
The honourable gentleman is very knowledgeable on these issues. I would just gently again ask him to look closely at the detail and the figures which show the numbers are low. So I do not recognise his characterisation of the future.
Right, Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And according to the statistics published by DEFRA last Thursday, an average farm in England is 88 hectares. That's roughly 1 hectare for every word that Labour had to say about farming in this manifesto. What assessment has the Minister made of the typical value of a farm of that size, around 88 hectares?
Minister.
I think the honourable gentleman will know that the definition of farm is actually rather complicated, and that is what makes this quite a difficult debate. And I'm not going to comment on individual farms, but the overall assessment, I go back to the point the Treasury figures show the number of claims likely to be affected by this is relatively low.
Jacob.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Farmers in my constituency before the election were very concerned about the ELM system. The ELM system hadn't worked for a long time. They felt like it was just beginning to work. Could the Minister please reassure farmers in my constituency that the ELM system is something that this government will be proceeding with?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for her contribution. I can absolutely give her that assurance. As I said earlier, I have throughout the last 5 years in opposition consistently been a supporter of the agricultural transition, and I'm determined to make sure it is successful.
Wendy Chamberlain.
Using temperate words, but my own constituent in North East Fife said to me, the government has left farmers the choice of selling now in a managed way or leaving it to their heirs who will be at the mercy of the HMRC and the banks. And either way, family farms will fall. The Minister today has talked extensively about the challenges of wealthy individuals coming in to buy up farmland. Does the government accept that this potentially increases that problem? And if it is a problem, what additional legislative steps are they going to take?
Minister.
Well, no, Mr. Speaker, I don't. For the reasons I outlined earlier, I think it will actually act as a disincentive for people to do that.
Dixon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Farmers in my constituency have told me they're struggling due to the abysmal implementation of the transition payment scheme by the previous government. Huge delays in getting payments and getting caught up in bureaucracy. Will the Minister reassure me and farmers in my constituency that this government is fixing those problems and speeding up payments to our farmers?
I can give my honourable friend that assurance.
David Hines.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ministers keep saying not to worry about APR because far more people think they will pay it than will actually get caught. Doesn't he recognise that that is actually part of the problem? Because you have to make business decisions now for an uncertain future, and this will have a depressive effect on the investment that we need in agriculture.
Minister.
Well, no, I don't agree, and I think if the honourable member looks at a number of the more thoughtful commentators in the debate over the last few days, he'll see that there are some very different views out there as to the impact this will have.
Sure. Jacob Collier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Minister for his comments about rural crime, which is a real issue in my constituency of Burton and New Toxteth. And we've heard no apology from the party opposite for cutting policing across our constituency. Can the Minister say more about the steps that this government is going to take to protect farmers from theft, antisocial behaviour and fly tipping?
Minister.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and it seems the party opposite doesn't understand that if you raise taxes and you can invest in the future, that means you can do more to protect people in a way they can't protect themselves. Absolutely vital we tackle rural crime. It has been a top issue that's raised with me consistently.
This year, Kearns. Catherine.
And it was quite clear amongst farmers they feel devastated and they feel the government does not understand them. Because farmers do not have liquid wealth, farmers rely on land as their asset to produce food, they turn a small profit but have a very constrained cash flow. Indeed, they have the lowest return on assets of any business sector, an average return of less than 1%. Losing a farm is not like losing any other business, it can't come back. Those are the Prime Minister's words. So the Minister come and repeat them since I'm a neighbour to my farmers in Rutland and Stamford and have that discussion with them.
Minister.
I've been on an extended farm tour for the last 5 years and I'm sure it will be continuing.
Catherine Fuchs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my constituency of Monmouthshire, farmers are indeed anxious and worried, so I want to ask my right honourable friend if he will help seek to reassure those small family farmers by spelling out the figures here. The Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury from last week said the exemptions mean that if someone has no other assets and is passing a farm on to a direct descendant, a farm or farming business worth up to £2 million can be passed on without paying any inheritance tax at all. Thank you.
100 acres, 10.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend. I'm very reluctant to become an offerer of tax advice to anybody. But what I would say is the advice I've been given is that it may even be more than that is available. I just would urge people to look closely at the detail rather than jumping to the worst conclusions.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Reference has been made to rural crime. Can I suggest that a whole new definition of rural crime is actually the proposals contained in the budget? The Labour Party have yet again shown that they don't understand the rural community. If family farms close, there will be a knock-on effect to grain merchants, dealers in farm machinery and so on. Can the Minister explain what assessment has been made of the impact on the total rural economy?
Minister.
Well, I'll agree with the honourable gentleman to the extent that absolutely the rural economy is closely integrated and one thing has an effect on another. But the thing that will be most beneficial to the rural economy is a strong economy which we are building and putting the foundations in place.
Rachel Gilmore.
I have 1,600 farmers in my constituency. 432 farms will be affected by this silly idea. That's not to mention their families, all their employees, all the shops and shopkeepers who rely upon our rural economy. This is an insensible, irrational and plain wrong in its interpretation of real life in our rural communities. It will be like the Highland clearances. Hundreds of years of tradition lost to the taxman. Before I ask the Secretary of State, Minister of State, to think again, I can say this with absolute certainty. The policies of my colleagues on this side of the House and the policies of the colleagues on that side of the House have reaffirmed the fact that it is only the Liberal Democrats who are the true champions of farmers and the countryside.
Order! No! No. Please. The question was long enough. I don't need to then start playing the politics around the chamber. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't recognise those figures. When I look at the figures the Treasury gave for the number of claims in the last year available, that is very close to the number in her own constituency, which seems unlikely to me.
Rupert Lowe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I should declare an interest as an active farmer of 865 acres. Secondly, I represent the constituency of Great Yarmouth, where we have some of the most fertile farmland in the country, and I have yet to come across anybody who, since the budget, thinks this is anything other than a terrible decision. Speaking at the Country and Land and Business Association conference before the election, the Shadow Secretary of State was asked whether Labour intended to change inheritance tax relief for farmland. The response: "We have no intention of changing agricultural property relief," quote unquote. Whilst I feel for the Minister in trying to defend the indefensible, would he like to take the opportunity today to apologise to the British farming community and, most importantly, commit to the reversal of this cruel assault on British family farms?
Minister.
The honourable gentleman well knows the financial state of the country that we inherited. Difficult decisions had to be made.
Harriet Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The average farm in Aberdeenshire is 490 acres and average values are about £5,000 an acre for bare land. So once you take that and add in things like a farmhouse, building, machinery and livestock, suddenly you're well over any IHT threshold and you have a huge hundreds of thousands of pounds IHT bill coming your way. DEFRA figures show that 19% of farms don't make a profit and 24% make less than £25,000. So does the Minister suggest that farmers sell the land they use to grow the food, sell the machinery they use to harvest the food, or sell the buildings they use to store the food in order to pay this bill?
Well, again, the honourable lady will know that farming policy is different in Scotland, but on the tax issues, which are UK-wide, absolutely right. What I'd suggest is she goes and gets her farmers to look in detail at these proposals, and what they'll find is the vast majority. Well, when she looks at them in detail, they'll find that the vast majority will be absolutely fine.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker. As a fellow Cambridgeshire MP, and having already announced a forthcoming ban on neonicotinoids for our sugar beet farmers, what message will the farmer give to Cambridgeshire farmers? What message will the Minister give to Cambridgeshire farmers so gravely impacted by the government's family farms tax that will lead to farmland being sold and potentially see more of our best and most versatile land used for vast solar farms? How does the slashing of agricultural property relief help farmers in Cambridgeshire?
Minister.
It's very good to see my near neighbour. What I would say, and I do say to Cambridgeshire farmers, is the thing they need most of all is a stable economy, and they also need a sound environment in which they can farm, and the measures that we're taking and putting in place will ensure their prosperity for the future.
Ibn Mohammed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister reassure this House the people of my constituency in Dewsbury and Batley and our country that the budget will not add to the cost of producing food and will not result in consumers having to bear the brunt of rising prices, higher inflation and higher interest rates.
The honourable gentleman makes an important point that people in this country have suffered gravely under the last government, and we will do nothing to make their situation more difficult. In fact, this budget, of course, protects the pay packets of the vast majority of the British people.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. From already very low margins on every farm, including those in mid-Buckinghamshire, will the addition of between £50 and £75 a tonne on the price of fertiliser through the government's proposed carbon tax increase food prices, and who will shoulder that burden? Will it be the farmer or will it be the consumer?
Minister.
Well, as the honourable gentleman knows, a whole range of factors that go into food prices, and of course what is very good news is the establishment of GB Energy and a move to a much more affordable and reliable form of power for farmers as well as our consumers. Will all be better off.
Joshua Reynolds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Friday, I visited an agricultural college in my constituency, and I heard concerns about how the changes in this budget will potentially strip an industry of young farmers. So what discussions did the Minister have with farming stakeholders on changes to the agricultural property relief prior to the budget?
Minister.
Well, the honourable gentleman will know that tax discussions in the run-up to budgets are a delicate issue, but there was no shortage of discussion in many of the columns and newspapers of this country, so there was clearly discussion. But I would just say, in terms of younger people wanting to come into farming, they face real obstacles at the moment, and this is a change that could well help them in that. He shakes his head, but I think if he talks to people who know about these issues, they will agree with me.
James Wilde.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister accept that agricultural relief was introduced to protect family farms from being broken up precisely to reflect their role as growers of our food and custodians of our countryside? So will he actually rethink this, do what Labour originally promised and withdraw this proposal?
Minister.
Well, as a fellow East Anglian MP, the honourable gentleman will know just how complicated farming is and how much it's changed over the last 30 years and how much it's likely to change in the future. What we've got to do is make sure that farming is in the right place to benefit from the changes that we're seeing globally and nationally. And most important, can farm in an environmentally and nature-sensitive way, because without that, we'll all be in deep trouble.
Stuart Andrew.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In his opening answer, he sadly we heard more government slogans and sound bites than we did a real understanding of the fear that farmers in my constituency of Daventry have been talking to me about. And I can assure him that they have been looking at the detail in great detail. One of them, whose father is sadly coming to the end of their life, they're now actively looking to sell off land because they simply cannot make the farm work. That's the next generation he talked about gone. That's food that supplies patients in the NHS gone. Does he not think this is a time for a reversal of this policy?
Minister.
What I think it's time for is people to take up the opportunities that the schemes that the previous government introduced and that we are continuing to allow them to farm in an environmentally and nature-friendly way. It'll be good for the future, it'll produce food for this country. There's a very bright future for British farming.
Alison Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the quite varied estimates as to how many farms are going to be impacted by these changes to the agricultural property relief, please can the Minister confirm how many farms he thinks will be impacted?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I refer the Honourable Lady to a previous answer that the figures are there for all to see in the Treasury papers.
You better be.
Matt Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since Wednesday, I've been contacted by devastated farmers from across Stockton West, families who farmed for generations and know that as a result of this budget, they'll be the last generation to do so. Has he made any assessment of the impact this APR change, this family farm tax, will have on the viability of tenant farming?
Minister.
Yes, we have, because we've looked at the figures, and I don't recognise the characterisation that he gives, although I do recognise that given some of the things that have been said over the last few days, I understand why people are alarmed.
Caroline Bowden.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In South Devon, we have some of the most expensive land prices in the country, which makes every farm, regardless of its size, worth a lot of money on paper. One farmer in my constituency said over the weekend, "We may be land rich, but we are cash poor, and our children will more than likely have to sell the land and maybe buildings to cover this tax. Without the land, the farm is simply no longer a farm, taking valuable land out of food production." The Minister says he values food supply, values food security. Agricultural Property Leaf gave us food security. The Minister says
Well, I think he's got it, Minister.
I understand the point the Honourable Lady is making, but just 2 points. One is, with proper planning, much of this can be avoided, and secondly, it is Devon actually is one of the counties where I've most often heard it said that people are coming in buying up land for the wrong reasons.
John Cooper.
Farmers in Dumfries and Galloway who have been contacting me over the weekend are not shroud waving. Let's be clear about that. Less clear is the figures here. The NFU say that in fact as many as 50% of farms producing food, meeting environmental targets, providing jobs in remote and rural areas could be at risk. Napoleon knew that an army marches on its stomach. And he also advocated that a good retreat is better than a bad stand. This government is making a bad stand. It has a chance to reverse this decision. Will you not do that?
Minister.
Could be at risk is a very broad definition. The figures are absolutely clear, and I suggest the honourable gentleman looks at them.
Manuela Portugal.
Mr Speaker, unlike in many countries dominated by vast corporate agribusinesses, the British rural landscape, including that of my constituency of Stratford-on-Avon, is defined by small family-run farms. They are local food producers, and they're also part of our communities. How does the government plan to protect this heritage against the pressure to sell to multinational agribusinesses in the face of a significant inheritance tax burden?
Minister.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, and absolutely we treasure that wide range of farms that we see across our country, very different in different parts of the country. The answer to her question is the agricultural budget is its highest level that it's ever been, and that will provide support to help particularly small farms. One thing that perhaps the people haven't noticed, the previous government ended the 5 hectare minimum level, and I strongly support that, and it will continue to be the case.
Nick Timothy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Farming families in West Suffolk feel deep anxiety, as other members across the House have explained, is happening in their own constituencies. And when they hear the ministers say that they don't understand the detail, or that they should listen to commentators who agree with him but not them, commentators who probably have nothing to do with farming in the first place, they will be furious with him. So will he apologise to those people? And will he explain to us why, if it's not such a big deal, more than 130,000 people have already signed the NFU petition telling him to change policy?
I at no point said that they didn't understand the detail. What I asked members opposite was to look at the detail, because when they look at the detail, they'll find the truth.
Callum Miller.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Family farmers in my constituency of Bicester and Woodstock are left confused and angry by this betrayal by the government over APR. They want to know whose daft idea was it. So can the Minister clarify, was it a proposal from DEFRA as part of the stability for farms that he outlines, or did it come from the Treasury? Minister.
There's nothing daft about putting this country's finances on a sound footing, and I'd say to his constituents, if you want a decent health service, if you want decent schools, if you want decent transport, this is a budget that will deliver it.
Dr Kieran Mullen.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I politely suggest to the Minister that the time for his weekend reading was before deciding the policy, not afterwards? I've heard from farmers in my constituency, like Jonathan Beinhall, who tells me the change to the relief will make it financially non-viable to pass on his very typical 450-acre farm. Does the Minister agree with me that the likely outcome of that is that investors, disinterested investors, come along and buy the farm instead, exactly the kind of thing that he seeks to avoid?
Yes. Minister.
I think the likely outcome is that people will put arrangements in place to pass on their farms at the appropriate time, and that will pull more people, younger people, into farming, which will be a good thing. But my overall message to farmers across Britain is this government is on your side. We're going to support you. Look at the agricultural budget. Look at the money that's been paid out the flood budget. We're with you. Don't listen to these people.
That completes the UQ. Really, it should come after statements, as you well know, Sir Roger, unless it's literally on this point. Oh, well, in which case, I knew you knew better than me. Sir Roger.
You wish to know, Mr. Speaker, whether you were given any indication as to why the Secretary of State was not here to respond to the urgent question.
Absolutely not. I just granted the UQ because I knew how important it was, including my good farmers within, surely. Right, before I call the Education Secretary to make a statement, I note the reports about the possible increase in higher education tuition fees started appearing in the media early this afternoon. The Secretary of State is... Mr Holden, you don't help yourself, do you? No. The Secretary of State is here to make a statement, so honourable members will have the opportunity to question. If the premature media reporting is due to an unauthorised leak, then it is great discourtesy to this House. I hope the Secretary of State will be able to identify the guilty party and take appropriate actions and brief me accordingly. So I now hope the Secretary of State is going to announce the leak inquiry and that we will get all the details of how this could have got out, and the House will be informed once that goes forward. Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, can I begin by saying I wish to express my deep regret that the content of the statement that I'm about to give appeared in the media earlier this afternoon. It had always been my intention to come before this House first to make the statement, given the significance and importance of this, because I appreciate that you, members across this House and our conventions, rightly demand and expect that. I hope you can accept my deep frustration and regret at what has taken place, and I will take whatever steps I can to keep you updated on the matter, because I do respect the conventions of this House and my responsibilities to this House, Mr. Speaker.
Can I just say, can we take it from now that there will be a full inquiry into how this has happened, that everybody will be brought in, questioned, and you will then update us with a full inquiry? That's what I really want.
Mr. Speaker, I can give you that undertaking, and I will speak to officials on the matter as you request.
Thank you. Secretary of State. Statement.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to make a statement about the future of our higher education sector and the changes that we will be making for students in the upcoming academic year 25-26. Before I go further, Mr. Speaker, I want to make clear the approach this Labour government takes to our universities and, above all, to the students whose education is their central purpose. Because the Conservative government didn't just talk universities down, they talked down the aspirations of working class families across our country. They dismissed the ambition of our young people and undermined their opportunities. This government takes a different approach. We are determined to break down the barriers to opportunity, and higher education is central to that mission. Higher education is part of what makes our country great. Enriching our culture, powering our economy, sustaining intellectual traditions, stretching back centuries. A beacon of opportunity, not just to students in this country, but from across the world. A sector of which everyone in this House ought to be proud. But when this government took office in July, we found a university sector facing severe